Hi, welcome to my Nokhud Offensive Mythic Dungeon Guide. In this video, I'll extensively cover the abilities of all enemies you will face in a Nokhud Offensive run. Nokhud Offensive is a long dungeon, which involves dragon riding as a means of travel between bosses. Very unique, but still lengthy. I'll be making a dungeon guide on all 8 of the slated Mythic Plus dungeons for Dragonflight Season 1, so be sure to subscribe if you want to catch those. Just like with my Shadowlands guides, I'll be marking important or impactful abilities in red and less important abilities in green. Additionally, I will be marking out abilities with their associated counterplay, including magic effects, enrages, curses, interrupts, bleeds for Drakthir, and poisons or diseases. Let's start. While you can approach this dungeon in any order you wish, most groups will fly to the nearest boss and fight them clockwise. In addition to this, each pre-final boss is guarded by a group of lieutenants. To summon the boss, you must first defeat all of the lieutenants. With that out of the way, let's talk about the first boss, Granyth. Granyth is blocked by 3 Nokhud Lancemasters. These Lancemasters have 3 abilities. Cleaving Strikes causes all Lancemasters' attacks to be a frontal cleave. Tanks face this away from the party. Their next ability is War Stomp, a slow AoE cast around the Lancemaster. You'll want to just step out of it. And finally, their most important ability is Disruptive Shout. After a long cast, they'll do fair damage to the whole party, and interrupt any casters. This is a priority interrupt, as it does a lot of damage. As for the other mobs, the first you may encounter is the Nokhud Planestomper. The Planestomper is identical to the Lancemaster, also casting War Stomp and Disruptive Shout. As before, you'll want to interrupt Disruptive Shout, but Planestomper do not have a cleave, so you don't have to watch out for that. Most packs will have at least one Nokhud Horn Sounder. These Horn Sounders cast Shoot at a random party member, nothing fancy. They only have one other ability, which is important to use a stop on. Rally the Clan is a cast which enrages all other enemies in the area. It's extremely important to stop this, but since you can't interrupt it, you'll want to use stops. Stuns, fears, CCs, and such. Failure to do so will result in a fair increase in incoming damage. The other mobs aren't as dangerous, but still important to know. The Beastmaster in particular can be quite dangerous. They cast Hunter's Mark on a random party member, marking that player for attack. This alone does nothing. However, there are War Ohunas nearby that will use this mark as a target. The Ohuna will cast Hunt Prey, granting it a 200% damage increase, and it will begin fixating on that player. That is a lot of damage if they get hit, so players will need to kite this aggressively. Next is the Nokhud Longbow. They only primarily cast Shoot at a random player. Multi-Shot, a large 40-yard frontal cleave, tanks will want to face this away, and Rain of Arrows, spawning several arrows around the battlefield that players should dodge. And finally, the Nokhud War Spear. There's not too much to worry about here. Swift Stab is a targeted charge at a random party member that applies a bleed to the target hit. Healers need to heal through this. And Pierce is a tank hit that applies a bleed. And that's all for the trash before Granyth. After defeating all 3 Lancemasters, you now face the first boss. Take note of the 3 ballistas around the boss, as they will be instrumental in defeating this boss. The boss's first ability is Shards of Stone. This ability deals unavoidable damage to the whole party. Healers will need to heal through this. The second ability is Tectonic Slam. It's a slow, large AoE stomp that you'll just want to run out of. The boss's last and most important ability is Eruption. After a short cast, every 3 seconds he will erupt, dealing significant damage to the whole party. Every time this deals damage, it applies a stacking debuff that causes you to take more damage from future eruptions. You'll want to stop this as soon as you can. Remember the ballistas from earlier? Well, during the fight, one of them at a time will be enabled. After a short timer, it will activate and you can use it to shoot the boss. Hitting the boss with the ballista will stun the boss and stop eruption. You'll only want to use the ballista after he starts casting eruption. You can tell by his energy bar. If he's at 100 energy, he can still cast eruption. Throughout the fight, saboteurs will continuously spawn, walking towards the currently active ballista. Should they reach it and successfully finish their cast of Dismantle, the ballista will break, and you won't be able to stop eruption. You'll want to slow, stun, and otherwise kill this saboteur in addition to damaging this boss. And that's it for the boss. He's not too difficult. With that, we move on to the second area, the Raging Tempest. The lieutenants in this area are Stormcallers, each uniquely named. These Stormcallers work in tandem with another mob called the Storm Surge Totem. Typically, these Stormcallers only cast Storm Bolt, dealing fair damage to a random party member, which should be interrupted when possible. If there is a nearby Storm Surge Totem alive, however, they also cast Totemic Overload. Upon finishing their cast, they deal party-wide damage and unleash a few Storm Orbs. Picking up these orbs grants players a stacking 5% damage and healing buff, though the act of picking up an orb also does damage to that player, so be careful when picking up multiple quickly. That's all there is to these Stormcallers and totems. Note that on death, the totem explodes and leaves behind a lightning field. Just avoid these. Among the mobs in the area, you will find Primalist Arcblades. They aren't too complicated, as they only cast Arcing Strike, which deals some damage to the tank, and also a little bit more damage to another nearby player. Primal Storm Shields are another simple mob, only casting a Storm Shield, granting them a small shield. Breaking this shield will deal damage to all players, but dispelling it does not, so you'll want to dispel these when possible. Storm Shields also do additional melee damage in the form of nature damage exclusively to the tank. Primalist Thunder Beasts are next. They cast a few abilities but are nothing too fancy. First is Thunder Strike, an interruptible strike on a random player. You'll probably want to interrupt this if you can. Thunderclap is an AoE slam that damages and slows players hit. And Chain Lightning is just Chain Lightning as seen in Shamans. You cannot interrupt this, so if possible, try to isolate yourself so it doesn't bounce around to other players. Off to the side that you may but probably won't encounter are Neophytes. The Nokhud Neophytes primarily cast Stormbolt at a random player. These do hit quite hard, so you will need to interrupt this frequently. Use AoE stops if you can. The only other threatening mob in this area are the Primalist Stormspeakers. There are a handful of them spread around the area. Their dangerous ability is Tempest, where after a cast they continuously pulse, dealing significant damage to the whole party. The damage also applies a dot that stacks. This is an absolute priority interrupt. They also cast Stormbolt frequently and summon Squall. The Squall itself is not very threatening, only really casting Surge a few times. Each cast of Surge will cause the Squall to take 10% of its health in damage. Eventually the Squall will kill itself, though you will likely want to interrupt Summon Squall if possible. Lots to interrupt here, so keep an eye out and coordinate interrupts. Lastly, there are a pack of 4 Primal Gusts. They don't do anything, they just have significantly large shields. Mages, specifically, can steal the shield to gain an insanely huge shield for 2 minutes. These are extremely potent and are great to pick up right before you start the boss fight. Otherwise, you can dispel these to kill them more quickly. After destroying all 4 totems, you can now face the Raging Tempest. This boss has a lot of outgoing damage, so beware. The boss normally starts the fight by casting Energy Surge. This increases his attack speed and damage significantly. You'll want to dispel this immediately to reduce incoming tank damage. Then he will usually unleash several lightning orbs around the area. Each orb slowly crawls back to the boss. If any of these orbs reach the boss will deal significant damage to the whole party, and additionally gain a 5% damage buff for the rest of the fight. These orbs are the exact same ones seen earlier when fighting the totems. Absorbing them yourself deals some damage to you, and grants you a 5% damage and healing buff. Players will want to pick up orbs as much as their healer can support to increase their damage. However, players should be careful not to pick up too many, as they may overwhelm their healers. The boss would probably then cast Lightning Strike, assigning a large AoE around each player. After a short duration, they will explode, dealing damage to all players caught in AoEs, and overloading lightning orbs caught in those AoEs as well. This is a rapid way to remove orbs without picking them up. When the orbs get overloaded, they explode in a 10-yard radius, so watch your feet. The boss's final ability is Electrical Storm, where for a full 15 seconds, the boss will deal continuous, unavoidable damage to the whole party. This is a lot of incoming damage. Use defensives and possibly self-healing if your healer is falling behind. Specifically for the tank, walking out of melee range will cause the boss to cast a lightning strike on you for as much as their melee damage would do, so there is no kiting this boss. Standing right below the boss will also deal significant damage to you as a player, so beware of that. And that's the whole fight. There is a lot of damage here, so be careful. And now we make our way to the third boss, Teera and Maruuk. The lieutenants for this boss are Soul Harvesters. These units only cast 2 abilities. The first is Death Bolt Volley. It does sound very scary. It deals damage to the whole party after a short cast. It's not a lot of damage, but at higher keys, it will surely be something to keep an eye on. Their second ability is Shatter Soul, where they shatter the souls of the 3 DPSs, increasing the Soul Harvester's shadow damage by a value, and reducing the damage dealt of that DPS by 30%. To remove this debuff, the players will need to go retrieve their lost souls. Other mobs in the area include the Ukel Corruptor. The Corruptor primarily frequently casts Death Bolt at their current target, dealing damage. Their big ability is Necrotic Eruption, where they spawn multiple orbs of shadow which explode after a few seconds, dealing fair damage. You'll just want to move out of those. You can stun them so that they stop doing this. Desecrated mobs can also be found in the area. The Desecrated Balakar has no mechanics and only hits a tank. The Desecrated Ohuna, however, has a very large frontal attack. Tanks will want to do their best to face this away from the party. The Ukel Death Speaker has one main ability called Chant of the Dead. After a long and easy to dodge cast, they explode in an AoE, granting all enemies a 20% damage and 20% damage reduction buff. Tanks will want to pull all enemies out of this AoE if possible. Additionally, Death Speakers cast Grasp of the Dead, slowing players and dealing damage, eventually immobilizing that player for a few seconds. The Risen Mystic only has one ability, Swift Wind, which grants all nearby enemies a 20% haste buff for 10 seconds. You'll want to interrupt this. And the Risen Warrior only hits the tank with Mortal Strike. Beware, as the Mortal Strike does stack, further reducing your healing received if you're attacked by multiple warriors. None of the required packs have any Beast Callers in them, but just in case you pull more packs and face them, they only really have one ability that needs to be stopped. Their Desecrating Roar ability is an ability that spawns multiple Balakars to their side. Though not very deadly, additional mobs is not very good for the duration of a pull, so interrupt this. Beast Caller's other casts include Heavy Slash, a devastating tank hit, and Devour Spirit, where they claim the soul of a target enemy, granting them a 100% damage buff. After defeating all 5 Soul Harvesters, you finally face Teera and Maruuk. Disturbed from their rest, you are here to return them to their rest. The first mechanic is Ancestral Bond. While the 2 bosses are farther than 10 yards apart, they each will gain an infinitely stacking 10% damage buff every second. Tanks will want to drag Maruuk to Teera, as Teera is a ranged unit. Typically, Teera will cast Quickshot, dealing damage to a random party member, and Maruuk will cast Brutalize, dealing fair damage to the tank. At regular intervals that generally overlap with each other, Teera will cast Spirit Leap, jumping to a new location. While that happens, Maruuk will cast Frightening Roar, a large fear AoE that does significant damage. While Maruuk stands still to fear, you can make your way to Teera and wait for Maruuk to catch up. And now for the big abilities. When Teera hits maximum energy, Teera will begin to cast Gale Arrow. After a few seconds, she launches an arrow at all players. When the arrow hits their mark, 4 tornadoes will be shot out in 4 directions from those players. Players will want to spread apart so you're better able to react to the incoming tornadoes. An advanced strategy is to stack up exactly on the same location, as the tornado spawns slightly away from the players. Stacking up will cause everyone to be safe, but you do need to move out as the tornadoes do make their way back to their default positions. When Maruuk hits maximum energy, he begins to cast Earth Splitter, launching several patches of earth in the direction of all players. You'll want to dodge these as they deal lethal damage. However, at the same time, Teera will cast Repel, rapidly pushing all players away from Maruuk, and continue to repel players for 4 seconds. You'll want to interrupt Teera, as this can disrupt players' ability to dodge Earth Splitters. And that's it for this boss. Do your best to keep them close to each other to reduce incoming damage. This last area is quite linear, and there are only a handful of mobs that can be pulled. There are quite a few mobs in the area, but most of them don't count for trash and they're not too difficult. The most dangerous among them is the Nokhud Defender. The Defender is a terrifying mob. Their primary ability is Blood Curling Shout, which is a 6-second fear. You must interrupt this, and if you face multiple at a time, you'll want to coordinate interrupts. They also cast War Stomp, just like the Lance Masters from the start. Just walk out of those AoEs. And they also attack in a cleave, just like Lancemasters. Tanks will want to face them away from the party. We've seen every other mob that patrol this area, but there is only one we haven't before. The Nokhud Thunderfist. They are actually quite dangerous. They primarily cast Storm Shock at a random party member, dealing damage and applying a dot. You'll want to interrupt this. But you may also want to save your interrupts for their other major ability, much more dangerous, Deadly Thunder. At the end of the cast, they stun the tank for 4 seconds, dealing an insane amount of damage. This is a top priority interrupt. But at the same time, you also need to interrupt the fears, so there's a lot going on here. The other mobs in this area include War Spears, Longbows, and Arc Blades, all we've seen before. After moving past the patrols and the guards, you fight 2 mini-bosses before the last boss. Batak and Balakar. Batak is melee, and is identical to the defenders seen earlier. Just interrupt their blood-curdling shout. Balakar, however, is quite unique. Balakar throws spear at players, so just dodge out of the way of the swirlies. Balakar casts Vehement Charge at a random player, charging in that player's direction. This can be annoying, so all players should generally try to face the charge towards a wall. Killing one mini-boss before the other causes the living one to gain an enrage buff called Raging Kid, increasing their damage dealt and cast speed, so try to kill them at the same time. Soothing the enrage is a temporary measure, as they will regain the buff after a few seconds. And we finally arrive at the final boss of the dungeon. The boss fight can be separated into 2 unique parts, with 1 intermission in between. The first part of the fight is slow and easy. The boss casts Rending Strike and Ravaging Strike on the tank, applying a bleed or dealing significant damage to the tank. Balakar casts Iron Spear at a player, throwing a spear at their direction, knocking them back, and following that up with a charge in their direction through Iron Stampede. You can't dodge the spear, but try to point it away from the rest of the party. Occasionally, Balakar will turn towards a player and begin to fling earth in that direction through Upheaval. While this happens, player will have a Quake erupt beneath them. Players should just dodge all swirlies and frontals here. And that's all to the first part. At 60% health, the boss will walk towards the front of the room and begin the intermission. During this time, he will be invulnerable to damage. The 4 adds will activate, and you must defeat them to reactivate the boss. The Stormcaller spam cast Stormbolt, dealing direct damage to random party members. This does a fair amount of damage and makes it quite difficult to collect all enemies to damage them in an AoE. You'll want to coordinate kicks, and hopefully bring them all together and kill them quickly before the damage overwhelms you. Throughout this intermission, Balakar will spawn lightning strikes all around the area. Dodge them. He will also do a blanket amount of damage through his ability Stormwinds. You'll want to finish this intermission quickly before your healer is overwhelmed by the damage. In the second part of the fight, the boss does his abilities from part 1 at a higher power level. The spear thrown now additionally pulls all other players into the location of that player. He will then follow it up with a charge, so everyone needs to move aside quickly. Upheaval is replaced by Crackling Upheaval. This additionally leaves behind a crackling cloud after he does his frontal. Just move out of them after he's casted. His tank hit also changes. It's now Conductive Strike and Thunder Strike. Conductive Strike applies a debuff that causes the tank to take additional damage from all future Thunder Strikes. This debuff stacks, so healers should dispel this as soon as possible. And that's it for the whole fight. And, as a matter of fact, that's it for the whole Nokhud Offensive. Definitely one of the longer, if not more complex, dungeons in the current rotation. It'll be interesting to see how Dragonflying is received by the Mythic Plus community. I make these videos to give players a full overview of the dungeons, as I like to be well informed of dungeon mechanics myself. I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you in the next dungeon guide.